Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1095th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Jenny Kendler and Julie Reiss. And now I'll introduce Jenny and Julie. Jenny Kendler is an interdisciplinary artist, naturalist, and environmental activist based in Chicago and various forests. Over the last 2 decades, her research-driven projects, centered on climate change and biodiversity loss, have been shown at prestigious international art spaces around the world and public locations as diverse as urban riverwalks, remote deserts, and tropical forests. She's a founding member of Artists Commit, an artist-led effort to raise climate consciousness in the art world. And our host today, Julie Reiss, is an independent scholar with a focus on contemporary art that addresses the climate crisis and the role artists play in social change. She's the editor of Art, Theory, and Practice in the Anthropocene, and the author of From Margin to Center, The Spaces of Installation Art. Julie teaches courses on art and sustainability. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julie to get us started.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you to the Rail for saying yes to hosting this conversation, which I am very happy we were able to organize as our contribution to New York's Climate Week. Of course, every week should be Climate Week, but this week we are looking hopefully more closely at climate-related issues. And Jenny's exhibition on Governor's Island is a great place to start having those conversations. I first wanted to say, if you haven't been out to Governor's Island yet to see Other of Pearl, the exhibition is up through November 3rd. And it's just Friday, Saturday, and Sunday now. It's fall hours. But what we'll be looking at today is not a substitution for standing right next to and interacting with and even participating in some of these artworks, not to mention seeing the really cool space underneath Fort J, which looks kind of like catacombs. So I wanted to talk with Jenny about the exhibition and also just about themes that had already begun appearing in some of her earlier work. We're going to be talking today about the role of empathy and shared vulnerabilities in art that deals with environmental issues and just general issues about seeing and being seen, listening and speaking, and language and translation. So just giving you some highlights here of what's actually in the show. We'll come back to the show. But Chloe, can I have the first slide of birds watching? I think we're going to start there. Jenny, this was the first work of yours that I had the pleasure and privilege of seeing in person when it was up at Storm King in 2018 as part of the exhibition Climate Signals, a really wonderful group show. And maybe what we could do is, could you start out by telling us what the work is composed of and why it's not bird watching, but birds watching? And I think we'll take it from there.
Yes. So what you're looking at is actually, it's a 40-foot sculpture. It's about 40 feet by 10 feet tall. And you're actually looking at 100 eyes of birds that are threatened or endangered by climate change. So that's, yes, the inversion of the title. It's not us watching the birds, it's the birds returning the gaze back to us. And so in this case, I really wanted us to think about what it might be like to feel sort of either pinned, scrutinized, lovingly gazed at by these others who, our human culture is largely responsible for pushing them to the brink of extinction. And so what feelings we might encounter in ourselves when having this gaze returned. They're printed, they're photographs, but they're printed on reflective panels, much like a street sign. So it's also this idea of a kind of like alert or a guidance sign of warning. And that's why in that first image that you saw, there was this sense of it kind of glowing at night.
I mean, I think that this idea of switching, we talk about the power of the gaze, whoever is the one doing the looking, whoever is that subject, can turn anything that they're looking at into an object. And running throughout your work, including in the current exhibition, we see the challenges that you pose to ideas of human exceptionalism and human domination of the natural world. And this piece is a silent piece. It focuses on the visual, but I think it really got that sense across of what it might mean to turn the tables a little bit. And that's something that if you can go to the next one, we can see here on the balcony of the Hayward Gallery, where maybe you ordinarily would expect to see a bunch of birds lined up that you could look at. Instead, the birds turning around and watching you. And Jenny, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this at one point also exhibited at a trailhead outside?
So there's actually 3 iterations of this work that exist. This is Birds Watching 3. The first one is the one you showed that was at Storm King, and that piece currently resides on the 606, which is an elevated Rails to Trails project, not unlike the High Line in Chicago. The second one is at the Eden Project in Cornwall, and then this is the third one, which of course with all my work, I always want to make sure that it has its own life cycle and think about where the work goes afterwards. So in this case, it's been on donated loan to the zoo in London. So the London Zoological Society, their ornithologists were actually very crucial in helping to create this third iteration of it. Each one, of course, is site specific and responds to the birds that are present in that region.
Oh, I didn't realize that. So so the birds at Storm King, those were local birds?
Yes, those were all birds of North America. And so this highlights the birds of Europe and the UK.
What do you think it will be for people to experience this at a zoo? It's an interesting turning of the tables.
Yeah, so right, zoos are an interesting and very complicated space. In this case, I think the Zoological Society of London is doing some really tremendous work around conservation. The scientists that I worked with are folks that are doing cutting edge research on genetics, looking at population bottlenecks and trying to think about how they can really save species from the brink of extinction. But I agree, it's a complicated space because we also, of course, have animals that are in captivity that maybe were they given their own choice, they wouldn't be in captivity. And so perhaps that lends another dimension to the work.
Let's go to the next one to tell it to the birds and see that extension. I'm really fascinated by this work, which again has had a couple of iterations. But in this case, well, why don't you tell us what we're looking at here and what it means to participate in this work?
Sure. So what you see in this image, again, this is the second iteration of this project, which was originally created when I was artist in residence with Natural Resources Defense Council. And we created the first version for the Expo Art Fair. So very different environment than here on the Queen Elizabeth Sculpture Court at the Hayward. But you are looking at a microphone buried in a dish of scented, sustainably harvested lichen. And the prompt that people are given when they come into this space is to tell a secret or make a confession to the birds. And as you speak into the microphone, or you can be a bit away from it as well, your words are live transliterated into the songs of these threatened or endangered birds. And so that would be, in the case of the birds of the UK, we were looking at, some very common birds that people would not have imagined would be threatened, like the common nightingale. And so we were really trying to raise awareness with the population there, but also that, propose that this moment of translation is kind of the first important step to any boundary crossing. And so there's this important and potent thing that happens when you realize that not only are the birds speaking, they're not just singing to, decorate our environment, but they actually have something to say. And then what it is to imagine ourselves in their proverbial shoes, although I realize it's a funny metaphor just with birds.
On their proverbial little feet.
Yes.
And is it more metaphorical, or are those words actually being translated?
This is a good question. And of course, it's the one that everyone asks. So that's why I'm using the word when I describe it. It's transliterated as opposed to translated. So transliterated is the literal description of what's happening, which is that it's being phonically matched. So the sort of shape and sound of your words are being matched to the shape and the sound of the bird song. One day, perhaps we can make this piece where it's actual translation, you know.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk later on about some of the collaborative work that I've done with Project SETI and David Gruber, who is engaged in a quite real attempt to use a large language model. I think maybe the one use for AI that I can really stand behind to translate the language of the sperm whale. And I can imagine a future in which we can do that with birds and we can understand more deeply what it is that they're saying to each other and maybe even communicate. But for now, it's transliteration.
I'm curious why you encourage people to tell a secret and not just, you know, say something and have it transliterated. Why the intimacy of the secret?
Well, I think you hit on it right there. So it is about intimacy. So it's about inviting people, as much of my work is into an intimate connection with not only the artwork, but with the subject matter. And so I think that idea of inviting someone to access something that's like quite personal and quite private to them is priming them to have a generative interaction with the piece. And the first time that we showed it, actually, it was inside of a closed dome. So people, partly because it was at an art fair, which is, you know, otherwise a commercial shindig, that's not always kind of the theme of my, or the, you know, the right vibe for my work. But we people were in this completely private space in that case, and we had many people come out in tears. So I think I also something that is often in my work is a desire to give people catharsis or release. You know, we all are living in this time of, you know, as Joanna Macy calls it, the Great Turning. Other people want to call it Anthropocene or late stage capitalism or climate collapse, but people bear a lot of weight on their psyches, whether they know it or not. And I think that the idea that art can provide some kind of solace or release is something, it's a gift that I would like to give, if I can.
I mean, from personal experience of the exhibition on Governor's Island, that I think that absolutely holds true. But let's go on to the next one, to Music for Elephants, which is a beautifully complex piece that from every part of it, from the materials that it's made out of, the data that it uses, the complexity of how the data relates to real time, and yet still maintains an identity as an object for contemplation. I think this is an incredibly intricate and impressive piece. And let's talk about this. And from here, we will go to the exhibition, but I think it's all related because this one as well uses sound. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this project, I believe I created it in 2016. This is, you're seeing an view of it installed at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, where it was during the bulk of the pandemic, and then luckily some time after. So it's a 1921 vintage player piano, and it plays a score that I created by writing an algorithm. This algorithm was populated with data that I obtained from people who work in Africa on elephant poaching of the African elephant, Loxodonta africana. And it looked at the kind of the differences between the amount of poaching, the amount of births, the amount of deaths, to kind of create essentially a mathematical equation that could predict how many elephants might die in any 1 month if poaching were to increase by only 1.5%. And the upsetting thing that I learned when I ran this script is that that meant that elephants would be extinct within 25 years. So with just that small increase in poaching. So we can, assume and hope that this is not what will happen. But I wanted people, again, to kind of take that emotional journey to imagine, each one of those notes that sounded on the piano.
Can we get the next slide, Chloe?
Yeah, each one of those notes that sounded on the piano represents the deaths of thousands of elephants. And then at this conclusion of the score, which is about 10 minutes and represents these 25 years, it falls silent. And this is presumptively the moment at which we, as a world, learn that elephants are gone from our planet forever.
Let's just get the next image also.
Yeah. And what I wanted people, again, to think about is, like that this, and this goes back to another theme in my work, materiality, and thinking about material histories, responsibilities, the complex ways that things weave through supply chains and culture, history, empire. Of course, this 1921 player piano, the keys of the piano are ivory, which is what's driving the poaching crisis. And so this music of extinction is played upon the very substance that is driving the extinction.
And I was thinking about something that you and I talked about a little bit recently, your interest and your emphasis on sound in conjunction with something visual. How does sound sort of get to people in a different way than, just looking at it?
Yeah, so I think that I came to it for several reasons. Firstly, because I was so interested in, I'm interested in language. It's very compelling to me. I'm like the person who always wants to look up the etymological reasons, the etymology behind words. I want to know the Latin names of things. I want to know why that Latin name was chosen. And so the idea of like language, communication, and vocalizations for non-human species is just something that's endlessly fascinating to me. But also, I think that there's something with sound where when we live in a world that's so oversaturated with visuals, we're on our screens doom scrolling all the time. We're inundated by advertisements. We're constantly presented with representations of how the world should be, that we can become really kind of like visually numb. And I think that sound is a way that we can come at people a little bit more obliquely and maybe enter in, it's also like it's deeply tied to emotionality, it's deeply tied to memory. And I think that the combination of the visual and the sonic can really be a potent space to kind of suspend people from an otherwise everyday reality and let them really experience the work in a kind of like de novo state.
Oh, I think it's very effective. Let's turn to the exhibition on Governor's Island now, where a lot of these themes come to play, including sound, translation, language, and just beginning actually with these first works that you see here. How did this show come to being? Because it couldn't be more perfect for Governor's Island and what Governor's Island has come to represent at least in the New Yorker imagination as a kind of hopeful place that is a kind of self-sustaining entity on itself that does its own recycling, its own composting. Governor's Island is sort of out there as a model of a kind of ecological space in and of itself. And I think, as I said, your show is really perfect there. But how did that collaboration come to be?
Well, firstly, I'm glad to know that because I sort of thought of it that way, but I wasn't aware that that was the common conception. They are, this is slightly tangential, but relevant at the same time that there's beginning to build a climate campus there. And so it really will be a place where we're kind of working actively as human beings to imagine what the future might look like. So yeah, I was invited to propose something for the public art program on Governor's Island. So this is with the trust itself. They do also like host other arts organizations on the island, like the LMCC, but this project was for the trust that runs the island itself. So I was invited in 3 years ago, and we started to look at spaces where the work might exist. And of course, I had already been following the work of Billion Oyster Project, who is one of our project contributors. And immediately, I mean, very, very quickly, I knew that this was the chance that I was waiting for to try this really ambitious project that I'd had, sitting in my sketchbook on slow simmer in the back of my mind for, possibly like 8 or 9 or more years. Which was this wild idea to try to grow sculptures inside of oysters. And so, yeah, I knew that this was the place. It could not have existed anywhere except for Governor's Island. It's a highly site-specific project. And this would be a great example of like, what happens if you give me 3 years to work on something? It's like, more and more intricate and specific to the place. And so we actually went several times through different sites that ended up not working out for, we'd have to use a generator for one, which I certainly thought wouldn't make sense for a show that was going to be ultimately about climate change. the other one didn't have the right feeling. And then honestly lucked into seeing this space under Fort J, which I believe had been not open to the public for a while, even though National Park Service does want it to be open to the public. And as soon as I walked in, I knew that this was the place where I wanted to put the show. So I had the, mise en scène in my head immediately, the way that it could be transformed through lighting, how the public would feel like they were discovering something truly magical and almost, almost private. And the sound, the acoustical properties of the space are incredible. I, of course, hope that those of you who haven't been able to see the show can go and see it, because there's no substitute for being able to experience the auditory qualities of that space, which almost connote, being inside the belly of a whale or a journey underwater, which was certainly something that we were thinking of, was how to have people imagine that they were in not a subterranean, but a subaqueous space. So yeah, it was really, this was the place that this show needed to happen. And
no, it's absolutely perfect forces coming together. Let's stay on this one for a minute. So these are what you see when you first come in, these oyster shells that, as you can see here, are growing pearls, have created pearls over these three-dimensionally printed tiny versions of classical sculpture. A process which I understand is similar to what happens when an oyster gets irritated by a grain of sand in its shell. It just gets busy and it smooths over that irritant, creating a pearl around it so that it won't have to feel those rough edges. And so essentially, the oyster is treating these miniature classical Western masterpieces as small irritants that need to be smoothed over. I mean, is that pretty much what's happening here?
yes, that's certainly a way to look at the project, and a way that I intended that the project be looked at. I think that there's something about this idea of the element of transformation, the transformation that could happen to Western culture and our most deeply held beliefs if we were to allow ourselves to be in true collaboration with the more than human world. There's something, as the person who wrote about this, and the Walker Mims who wrote about the piece in the New York Times did say, he calls them, I think, vaguely terrifying. And that's there too. The idea that there is something vaguely terrifying about that release of agency, about what might happen to our most preciously held objects, or even cultural concepts, if we were to allow them to be mutated essentially in collaboration with others. These are such icons of Western history. They're not only, myself as a sculptural practitioner, they're kind of the foundation of my practice. But we can also see how preciously they are held as symbols of empire, of human exceptionalism. We know that the British Museum, for example, refuses to give theirs back to Greece, although they seem to be in all rights to belong to Greece. So I think that they're just a subject that's really ripe for exploration. Also these individual characters that are shown here play key roles in so many of the founding myths of Western society.
Yeah, and can we go back just to Chloe, if you can go back about one, go back there, here, let's stay here. Wait, I mean, this one is, to me, a stroke of genius, right? This is Zeus throwing the thunderbolts, right? This is like the ultimate symbol of power on so many levels.
His throwing arm has been corroded. He's sort of like held in this wave of nacre that's covering his body. Yeah.
This one I just found particularly fascinating, but also to the theme of terror, to me, it's also the possibility of a post-human world where human records of culture cease to have any meaning and are just washing up, sort of thing. And in fact, many of these things, the Greek sculptures themselves washed up, right? That's how they came to be. Every now and then a new one washes up. So there's something, they come out of the sea. So there's some of a sense there of them being literally diminished because they're so small here. And also just going back from whence they came in a potential time where some of the things that we hold very dear might cease to matter. And I think that the genius here, to the idea of terror, is that you're able to communicate this in an object which is actually really beautiful. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I look at a lot of really wonderful and really informative art that has to deal with sustainability and the climate crisis. And there's a lot of ways that I can talk about that work, but talking about it in terms of aesthetics is not always the first go-to. And I feel like in your work, we can do that. And I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that kind of decision making.
Yeah, well, thank you for noticing that. I mean, I'll say in these pieces, it's very intentional that they're not just covered over. That would have been a different way to do the project, right? That they could have been ground to dust or obliterated entirely. I'm not actually interested in that. I think that what is compelling for me is entering into a new phase of generative human culture where we actually don't know what the outcome will be, and we release agency and control over that, which is exactly what I was trying to do with this project, which was also vaguely terrifying because I had no idea if this project I promised to the curators was going to work. But that element of beauty is really important, because what I'm proposing also is that as we go through this gauntlet again of this great turning in our culture, which is what I think we hope will happen, and that we won't end up with hundreds of years of fascism instead, is that there's something very beautiful on the other side. It might be a strange beauty. It might be a beauty that takes our eye or our mind some time to get used to. It's not something that we have been acculturated to already. But I think of beauty as a lure also to tell people that they're welcome to the work, The themes that I deal with are not easy themes, biodiversity law. What does extinction mean? Extinction is not just an end of it's not just an end of a species, but it's also the end of birth, right? So it's something really profound. What does it mean that our whole way of life might have to change? These types of themes are not so easy to deal with, but I think that I don't have any interest in kind of punishing the viewer. When I was involved as an organizer in Extinction Rebellion, one of the key principles that organization holds up as, flawed as that group may be in some ways, is something that I think is really smart, that I learned from doing activism and organizing work, which is to not blame and shame individuals. So I think that principle holds true in my work. I'm not interested in holding people. I'm not interested in, in making people feel called out or shamed. I understand that these are cultural forces. It's not absolving people of individual responsibility, but that beauty is part of what is showing people that they're welcome here, that there's a tenderness for them. It also is something that's just as an artist and someone who's actually deeply invested in the history of art and what that means. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, Right. But most of the works of art that remain compelling to me, that I think about on a regular basis, they're beautiful.
Could we have a body burden? Can you just, speaking of beautiful things, can we go down to the there we go, that one.
Nature is beautiful,
I mean, this one, which is such a beautiful offering, almost like a delectable dessert in a cup, right? But it's actually the eyeball of a blue whale, right? It represents the eyeball of a blue whale. But you have to, see it as, I think, as you are saying, a very generous offering. How are we invited to come up close? How are we invited to see this as something that is incredibly beautiful and incredibly fragile at the same time? And to be able to communicate that through the materials, everybody who's watching, you have to really think about what it means that this is represented to us in sea salt, New York seawater, human tears, and hand-dyed silk velvet, patinated steel, this incredible mixture of, of nature and culture, right? Putting those things together to get us to actually take a look and think about the message that you're trying to give in this work. So I thought this one was a particularly effective one. And I want to point out that nearby this one, Jenny has left a book where people can write. The book asks you, what would you like to say to a whale? And when I went to see the show just a few weeks after it had opened, I mean, that book was already full. You're going to need to put other books in. And the messages that people wrote, page after page after page, was, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I found this really moving because I feel that, personally, as you said, it's not about blaming and shaming the individual. These were not individuals who had ever taken down a whale, but just on behalf of being human to have that response and to actually have a place to express that in the exhibition. I thought that also was very generous, because you could come away with a certain amount of climate grief and fear, and we could all add our tears to this work. But I felt it was a nice gesture to offer people a place to say something. And I just, it's really my comment more than a question, although I just wondered if you'd had a chance to take a look at some of those responses and what you thought about that.
Yeah, let me flip through it really briefly. I'm hoping to spend some time with it after the exhibition closes. But yeah, it's that prompt also, is related to the Tell It to the Birds piece that we talked about earlier. And I know that's why you included it in the slideshow. But there is, it ties into the work that the adjacent room contains, which is the humpback instrument piece.
Here, can we go to that one?
So that piece is, again, similar to Tell It to the Birds. It's inviting you you see this, this is quite a distorted photo, but what you're looking at is this hand-blown opaline glass stem that has like a bifurcated opening on it that evokes both the blowhole of the humpback whale, which is this beautiful like double leaf shape, and also human trachea. So kind of making analogies between the human body and the non-human body, which you'll see also throughout the show. The eyeball, for example, that's made with human tears. And so you're invited as a viewer, again, to go up and think about, in this moment of, our nascent ability to perhaps speak to the whales, although I don't think anyone is quite working on humpbacks yet. But we're inviting the public to speak into that aperture, and that, again, their words return to them as the song of a whale. So you can see in this picture, there's both this main vessel, which is based on the interior organs of the humpback whale and this blowhole. And then there are these speakers that have the kind of blowhole tracheas. There's 4 of them. You can't quite see them in the dark corners, but one of them plays back your own song, plays it back to you in whale. Humpback whale, and then the other ones play this historic whale recording, which I think we'll actually get a chance to listen to at the end of the talk. That was recorded by Roger and Katie Payne, who were kind of the preeminent scientists of their generation studying humpback whales. And I'll save a little bit of that story to tell at the end before we listen.
And am I right that it was when we learned that humpback whales could sing, it was the beginning of the whale conservation movement?
Yes, yeah. So that was, that's what I say, is that really like that. It not only that discovery, whatever a human discovery means, of course, the whales.
Yes. They were always singing. We know, yes.
Yeah. So that discovery really, really catalyzed not only the Save the Whales movement, which eventually led to the Marine Mammal Treaty, which forbid the majority of the nations in the world from killing whales. But also, the Paynes were really smart in the way that they thought about cultural dissemination. They worked with National Geographic, and they created a record that was one of those printed records that went inside of, I don't even know, 1 million, how many copies of National Geographic that went out all over the nation. and really changed the way that people understood whales. The Save the Whales movement and the marine mammal hunting ban were profound in what they did for marine mammals. They also were a really important part of the genesis of the environmental movement, period. So those movements were interlinked and were happening around the same time as the first Earth Day, around the same time as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So it really, can't be underestimated, the contribution that, these gentle scientists made when they actually took the time to listen to what another species might be saying.
I just think that it is, it's so huge, because thinking about the non-human world as not having speech, and thinking of humans as being exceptional because they have speech, has been such a justification for putting the human at the center of everything. And now so many things are coming out about the way the non-human world operates and communicates and links between ecosystems. And you mentioned Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which this book came out in 1962, and really began to show people that humans were affected by and interwoven with the natural systems, as opposed to the long, specifically Western European idea of humans being outside of nature. There's the forest, but we are outside of it. If we go into the forest, we need to be armed and we need to have horses, because the forest is a scary place, but we are not part of that. And it's also, we are superior to it. And so that Silent Spring begins to show people that if you contaminate these ecosystems, you're going to destroy your own habitat, that we are part of this habitat. But I'm not surprised that the power of the whale song would have been such a catalyst. Again, if you go to Governor's Island, people who are listening, I went out there, and the day that I went, there was nobody there. I went early when it just opened, and I sang the Star Spangled Banner into the tube, just out of curiosity, what it would be like if it was reduced to whale song. And it was so wonderful to just kind of hear it taken down to a series of kind of strange, wonderful sounds. And then I recited a poem, and it was interesting because my speaking voice, it translated as lower tones than my singing voice. But I just got this little moment, this glimpse of what it would be like if you could actually have those communications. And I felt definitely more on the same in the same world with another species, and less outside. So it's a great experience. And yeah, whale bells. So this is a piece that you have shown before. I know it wasn't made in 2024, but it's this iteration of it here. You have someone, if you're there at the right time, lucky enough, who will play these whale bells for you. And again, allow you to hear these almost unearthly, beautiful sounds. Jenny, this is another one that has very sort of complicated genesis. Can you just talk us through what we're actually seeing and hearing here?
Yeah, well, firstly, I want to emphasize that this is the one collaborative work in the show. So this is not just by myself, but also by my friend and fellow artist, Andrew Bernat. And we worked together on this project starting in 2018. We were initially commissioned to create a set of these bells for a National Geographic icebreaker, where they're actually rung by the waves themselves as the ship travels over these 30-foot Arctic swells. And what you're seeing inside of them, and what actually rings the bell as the clapper, are Miocene epoch fossilized whale ear bones. They're called tympanic bullae. And they are the bone, like the equivalent to the kind of hammer and stirrup and anvil inside of our own ears, as tiny as those bones are for us. You can then imagine how much bigger these whales were. There is this odd poetic coincidence that they resemble very closely the shape of a human ear. That is just natural synchronicity. But we imagine this idea of the kind of ancient seas that these whales would have swum in. They're rorqual whales, meaning they're the ancestors of modern humpbacks, 5 to 20 million years ago. And, they would have lived in a world profoundly different from ours. This was before, we were a glimmer in Australopithecus's eye. And they, you know, they would have been probably the most culturally sophisticated creatures on planet Earth. So singing these elaborate songs, their art form, whatever, you know, we may find it to be. And I was trying to imagine what it might be like to sort of, in a poetic sense, release that resonance into the contemporary world. So what those very real earbuds heard, what would it be to kind of release that message? You know, again, deep time is something I think about a lot in my work, and that has to do with also the decentering of the human. Yeah.
Is that actually a paint color, climate change white?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's kind of a minor note in this piece. Yeah, you can see that it's a Bear paint in S350-1 climate change. That's the name of the color. You can find it on paint chips at Home Depot to this day, I believe. When I discovered that, I was fascinated and used it in quite a number of projects. I also want to point out that it's S350, which is, 350 parts per million for carbon is the threshold, which we were not supposed to exceed to have a planet. And of course, now we're more at like 420 or something like that.
Strange coincidence.
My mom.
Very scary.
Yes, so I doubt it's a coincidence. I think someone at that company knew exactly what they were doing, but I will one day hunt down why that paint color is named that. It's very interesting to me.
Very strange.
Yeah,
I want to go to the next work because I realize I want to make sure we have time to go through all the works in the exhibition. This one really struck me. From a distance, it almost resembles, a hanging skeleton. And we get closer, we learn a lot more about it. But it's also the only human form in the exhibition. That we're looking at all of these different ways that marine mammals and oysters can maybe speak and tell stories. And then you have this human form, which, again, we think about fragility, is just actually incredibly fragile in the way that it's made. And let's go to the next one, which is a close-up of it. So there you can see better. Mother of pearl, the nervous system. How does this one, well, let's first tell us a little about it, and then let's talk about how it relates to the other works in the show.
Yeah, well, I guess I do want to say that there actually are lots of touches on the human body. This one is the most obvious. But there are human ears.
That's true. Their ears and the oyster shells.
I mean, they're subtle, and you're right on track with most people in thinking like, oh, there's this one human thing and it's not elsewhere, but it's sort of subtly woven through. It was a very intentional thread. There was those kind of like trachea, blowhole hybrids, and then there's the kind of that hybrid of like the whale's eyeball made with the human tears. So there are these like touches. So again, this is a hybrid object, right? So it's a human nervous system, but it's made with pearls. So it's sort of just like a little bit inverting that relationship of like what element is more salient. So it's strung with, I don't know, I refrained from asking my studio assistant to count them, but I'm tens of thousands of freshwater pearls, and took something like 8 or 9 months to make. 10 hours to install, and is based on my nervous system, so it's supposed to be just about my size, and is thinking about a few things. Perhaps this is one of the more abstract or evocative pieces in the show that is intended to just have us think about that kind of like living, vibrating, shimmering thing that we have inside of us, this incredible gift that we can feel the world, be sensate, that we have this somatic experience of what it is to be inside of an animal body. So it is a reminder of that. I hope that maybe people might imagine like what it would feel like to have this shimmering network inside their own body, and then realize that they do, and that they can activate it, pay more attention to it. There was also this sort of metaphor of thinking about mothering. I'm the mother to an almost 6-year-old, and I'm a solo parent, and I spend a lot of my time, doing care work, thinking about my child and what I'll pass on to her. And I thought about this idea of like this string of pearls, going back in time, from me to my mother, to my grandmother, back and back and back and back until we all are non-humans. And how, you know, we're knitted together in this link, where if you cut anyone, they all the pearls fall to the floor.
Oh, I really like that. I like if you think about what does a pearl signify? So, you know, it's precious, it's rare, but also strand of pearls, and the strand of pearls given definitely through generations. And to imagine ourselves as being made of the same stuff as something that's created by another creature, and our similarity to that stuff, not again to kind of the idea that we are so very different, and to help remind people that human beings are just one more species. So I think that interspecies use to create a human body out of these pearls, I think that it really it gets a lot of that across. Let's go to the sperm whale. So here's something I really liked about the show. I came in there knowing a little bit about whales. I came out having learned a lot about the difference between a blue whale, a humpback whale, and a sperm whale in terms of their size, the sounds that they make. And I was just amazed because this is not an exhibition that in any way centers on learning information. And yet I learned a lot of information from these artworks. So the sperm whale, which now I know, sperm whales don't sing, sperm whales click. Let's talk about what the makeup of this piece is, and how it conveys something important about the sperm whale.
Yeah. So there was a deliberate attempt on my part to sort of represent the main groups of whales. So the humpbacks are part of Balaenoptera, which is the group of whales that are filter feeders. They have the baleen, and we all know about, you know, them sucking in and feeding on tiny organisms, the krill, oftentimes. The sperm whale is a prime example of an odontocete, so that's a toothed whale. They have really different types of culture, different types of vocalizations. They're the whales that, you know, dive to tremendous depths, in this case, oftentimes hunting and preying on giant squid. And but both of these species of whales were hunted, you know, terribly during the era of whaling. I point out in the wall text that you're referring to that I wrote for the show, that, you know, we may think of the high era of whaling as being in, say, the 1860s, when people are sailing around in wooden ships and throwing harpoons. In fact, the most whales were killed in the 1950s, during the era of diesel ships, when these giant factory-sized ships that, you know, whales could not outrun them, just were slaughtering tremendous amounts of whales. And they were processing their bodies and taking these oils from their bodies. In the case of the sperm whale, which had some of the most prized oil, they have these organs inside of their head that the whalers would cut open and harvest the oil from. That's the spermaceti organ and what's called the junk. Those also are the organs that the whale uses to communicate. So that's what you're seeing represented here, is a stylized representation of those internal organs that the whale itself uses to speak to other whales, or to echolocate and find their food. But that top organ would be the spermaceti organ, which is what was filled with this, you know, viscous fluid that whalers incorrectly identified as sperm, and thus the name of the whale, which maybe we can get changed one of these days. And then the junk would be these sort of series of collagen lenses surrounded in this fatty medium, and that's what's represented by these almost perfume-like bottles. And what you're seeing, each one of these tiny vessels has essentially returned to it a type of antique whale oil. So this was oils that were used at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, up until, you know, the moratorium on whale hunting in 1985, for everything from lubricating sewing machines, automobiles, bicycles, clocks, firearms. They were used in cosmetics. They were used in clocks and watches particularly, which I find to be particularly like compelling to think that like our sense of time as human beings was lubricated by this oil that the whales used to communicate with their loved ones. And then in the case of spermaceti, they were used to make candles. So for example, you know, Thomas Jefferson's table would have been illuminated by these very high quality, expensive candles. And so like, you know, the Declaration of Independence possibly lit by oil taken from the communication organ of a murdered whale. So really the literal, I mean, one of the important things about this show is I want to tell the kind of origin story of the climate crisis all the way back to it literally, to showing that it's literally founded upon the bodies of non-human others. And so our cultural wealth, our material wealth has come historically in many ways from extracting and creating sacrifice zones in the bodies and the cultural ways of species that are not human. And this really is the poison at the heart of our culture. You know, this is what I think has allowed us to continue to exploit the earth to the point of collapse where we are today. And moreover, I think that it's the, you know, human supremacy is the kind of supremacy that underlies all others. So that underlies patriarchy, that underlies white supremacy, because when you can say, oh, you know, that the woman, she's hysterical, she's acting like an animal, or people of color, they're animals. That's that ability to say, well, because we can other the animal, we can use their body as a fungible resource, then we can apply that to other groups of human beings too. So if we want to tackle that challenge and have equality among human beings, I really think that we have to go back even further and right this essential wrong of feeling like we have dominion and we have a right to simply take from the bodies of others. So, you know, this piece is partly, it's intended very directly to show the perversity of that, you know, that we light our tables and that we cause another culture to go extinct.
And I think to focus those ideas specifically on the sperm whale is a really inspired gesture, in part because of the project that's going on right now, Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, which, as far as I understand, is using machine learning and AI. The hope that eventually, not too far in the future, we'll actually be able to understand what the sperm whales are communicating with their clicks. And at that point, again, the justification for having dominion of, well, others can't talk. Others don't have a language, or we don't understand that language, so we don't have to listen to it. The sea change that could come if we actually could hear those words and understand that gives agency to a non-human species. I think it could have huge ramifications just in general for, again, the justifications that you've described to have certain humans claim dominion over massive parts of other humans and of nature. So the last work in the exhibition, this one here, beautiful arrangement of oyster shells. Again, the Governor's Island is working on the Billion Oyster Project. They're reseeding the waters around New York with oyster beds. They collect oyster shells. Restaurants send them the oyster shells. They get cleaned off and dried out and reseeded, and then they're going to go down and back into the water, where they will hopefully just clean massive amounts of water through their own natural filtration system. So it was nice to kind of close the exhibition with oysters. And as you pointed out, again, a human, non-human collaboration here. Tell me about the ear that's in the middle.
Right, so you can see, if you look for the objects in this image that are slightly luminous or more like kind of shimmering white, you'll see that intermixed among oyster shells, what you are looking at is actually the shapes of human ears that have been 3D printed in a biopolymer They were scanned from the people who are part of the Billion Oyster Project. So the scientists and advocates who are quite literally listening to the ocean, have their ears represented here in this work, which has the title Seashell Resonance. I think that this may be slightly mistyped in this. So seashell resonance objects for contemplation. And this seashell resonance is the technical name for the term of what it means when that phenomena that I hope most of you have experienced. And if you haven't, please find a seashell somewhere where you were told when you were a child that you could hear the ocean inside of a seashell, which I think is so beautiful. And of course, what you're actually hearing when you do that is it's creating a resonance chamber, and you're hearing the sounds of your own body. So you're hearing your own internal sea, the sound of our nervous system, the sound of our circulatory system. And that's the sound that, evokes for us the sound of the ocean. So for me, it was a beautiful way to kind of end the show with this reminder of those deep connections.
Well, I think that works really beautifully. And yes, it takes a moment to realize that some of these things are not like the others. And this mixture, you can see how close in form the oyster shell is to the human ear, to the point that in some ways nature repeats itself. You find something on land and something equivalent in the sea, just in terms of the forms that exist on this planet. It's also a great way to see that, human beings as part of a larger ecosystem. We isolate a body part, it looks like something else that we've seen before somewhere else in nature. So those are the works in the show. Jenny, I think we've arranged to make sure everybody can hear a little bit of humpback sound. Before we close and go to that, I just to sort of reiterate the power of this exhibition, I think also just lies in how informed you are about all the science that goes into it. And I wondered if you could just give us 1 minute to talk about your collaboration process. You come as an artist, and how do you sort of end up at the table with the science part of this?
Yeah. I think like those of you who are listening might start to get a sense of a kind of coherent set of ethics or principles behind my work. The idea of decentering the human. I also am invested in the idea of working to dismantle the old concept of what it is to be an artist, that you work in isolation. You're usually a man, perhaps a suffering alcoholic, who's painting their anger and their fears out into the world and then receiving accolades for being an individual genius. Not only do we know that that was like almost never true, cite Pollock and Krasner, for example, but I think that there's much more interesting ways to make creative work in the world. And I really believe in the power of collaboration, not just as like a sort of conceptual device in that sense, but in the way that it, as a practitioner, I, did not formally study conservation biology or botany or, marine biology, although I did have someone when I was giving a tour in the space last time ask me, like, as a marine biologist, where I gave other tours. It was very pleasing to me, but not true. So I think that, for me, the chance to learn up close from other people is really profound. And, I was very grateful to have collaborators on this project, such as, Enrique Arizmendi, who helped to grow the pearls with me, and the Billion Oyster Project, who provided the shells and their ear scans very graciously, and David Gruber and Project SETI, who provided not only those historic humpback whale recordings from David's dear friend Roger Payne, who passed away last year, but also we didn't mention in that room with the sperm whale instrument, you're also hearing the sounds of the sperm whales, their codas, which are their communicative click patterns, through these special ultrasonic speakers that make it sound like the sound is kind of emerging inside of your own head, evoking the experience of what it might be like to be sort of body scanned by a whale that you're free diving with. So I think, we can't do it alone, right? We're not only social animals ourselves, but we also are, part of this like larger biosphere. And so working collaboratively just seems like the most natural thing in the world. Also, I'm a giant nerd. I'm really curious. I wanna know what other people know. And that's one of the most fun parts for me, you know, that really keeps things interesting.
And I think your work is really a great example of kind of pushing that those boundaries. And to just finish up on the idea of the role of the artist or the responsibility of the artist, what happens to the works in the exhibition when it's over?
Yeah, so I think about my work from start to finish. I want to like think about using materials that are recyclable, like steel, or glass. Glass is highly recyclable, biodegradable, like the salt, or things that can be reused in other capacities. The bells will be traveling onto the Buffalo AKG Museum for a survey on 10 years of public art. I did a public art project with them about 10 years ago. The other works are returning to my studio in Chicago. We'll see where they go next, except for some of the oysters with the sculptures in them. So the ultimate goal of that project is to auction off those sculptural oysters and use those funds to help create a new oyster reef with Billion Oyster Project. And so that's thinking, I mean, honestly, it's about wealth redistribution. It's imagining, you know, we told the story of the sperm whale and how we accumulated wealth. And this is the same story with the oyster, which we didn't get into as much, but we accumulated wealth by, you know, eating the bodies of the oysters, by trading them, by making products out of them. And that wealth became generational wealth, became corporate wealth. And now, you know, their wealth is concentrated at the upper echelons of our world in this like hands of, you know, hundreds of billionaires. And our oceans, for example, have been impoverished. And so I'm thinking about literally like, you know, wealth redistribution and returning that wealth back to the bay. So we auction off the oysters and then we use that for ecological restoration. And I think of that really as an extended sculptural practice that, you know, the final sculpture is one that exists under the water.
And it just is that sort of in line with the goals of Artists Commit, an organization I know that you've been very involved in?
Yeah, so Artists Commit is a group of artist activists and arts workers that I co-founded with some wonderful peers of mine. I really encourage you all to look it up. There's a lot of resources on the website in terms of what you as an artist or creative practitioner can do to make your practice more sustainable and to reduce your carbon footprint. One of the primary things that we do is something called the Climate Impact Report, which is a form that allows people to, in an expansive way, understand where the inputs and outputs of their exhibitions are. And so I'm sort of naturally practicing that and have been for a long time, although I will do an impact report for this exhibition in particular, because it's always educational to kind of see things in their granular form. But we look at energy inputs. So we're looking at, you know, what's the carbon footprint for the show. We provide resources to a carbon calculator that we've worked with Gallery Climate Coalition in the UK on. And we ask people to look at waste streams. So where does the work go afterwards? You know, how many things did you create that were disposable? We reuse packing material for pretty much everything in this show. We tried to buy, you know, as little plastic or anything that couldn't be reused as possible. You know, when the work gets shipped, it's going to be using another artist's crates and packing material. So we're really trying to think about that at every step of the way. It also looks at human impact. You know, we're thinking about with, you know, people who have labored to help to produce the show. Are they equitably treated? Are they fairly compensated? And so we're really trying to get people to take a holistic look at their own artistic practices. And our methodology and our theory of change is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so we're thrilled that, you know, institutions like Modern and LA MoCA have, you know, taken this form on, and we hope it will just spread.
Great, thank you, Jenny. I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions and for people to hear the sound of the humpback. So let's turn to listening to a non-human voice.
So really quickly before we do that, I do have a few audience questions and then we'll close out with the whale sound.
Okay.
So the first question, first of all, before I go into the questions, thank you both so much for this conversation, which has been such a treat to listen to. And many congratulations to you again, Jenny, on this exhibition and on this project, which involves so much research, which is a perfect segue to GE's question. GE is wondering, as your work is, or at least seems so research driven, especially in the way it centers a state of wonder in the natural world, can you share some details on how you go about your work and your research? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, certainly there's not like one methodology. I read pretty voraciously. I'm, probably read more about science than I do about art. So I always, have some, nonfiction book that I'm tearing through and making notes. I'm also a naturalist. I'm trying to be out in nature as much as I can and make observations and think about, what's interesting or compelling to me there. And I really like to be in conversation again with scientists and other research practitioners. So, when I enter into a collaborative relationship, I have really clear ideas, but I oftentimes will try intentionally to be sure that they're not really fully baked by the time I get into conversation with another person, because I want to allow them to be in the state where they're kind of fluid enough to continue to mutate and, change in response to what I'm learning from somebody else. Yeah, I don't know. I never want to stop learning. And so usually some new fact or something that I've learned is like it's like what Julie said about the pearl, I get that little irritant that kind of sticks in me, and I don't always know what's going to form from it, but I have these kind of, something I learn and I go, oh, that's going to be a piece. And oftentimes, honestly, it takes me years to make the pearl. I have to think and think and think, and then I'll learn something else, and those will start to fit together. Because there's this like way that I make my work when I know that it's right. Is there is a kind of like internal logic or like, self-symmetric poetry that exists within the work. And it's almost like a narrative too, where kind of you have to have the beginning and the end. So I can simmer on an idea for a very long time, as you heard with the pearl piece itself.
Thank you so much for that answer, Jenny, and thank you for that question, GE. The next question is going to be from Madison at the Rail. Madison, feel free to unmute.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for this conversation. Your dialogue sparked this idea of communication and legitimacy, especially some comments you made, Jenny, about like how the hierarchy of human to animal and how we use that to like delegitimize other human beings. And there's this book called Animal Languages by Eva Meyer, and it explores attempts for animals to communicate in a human form. And just this exploration of like ways we've tried to have them reach that communication, whether it's through sign language or like repeating our form of language. And the book gets into it, but I feel like your work explores this too of, do you find that our disconnect with other species and other cultures is not only about communication in general, like an ability to communicate, because we can see that in these whale sounds, but to communicate in our way. So are they speaking our language? Are they communicating in the way we communicate, whether it's animals or other humans? And do you feel like your art attempts to bridge this communication gap in some way?
Great question. You saw me look behind me because I was like, oh, that book is on the shelf over there.
Really? I love it. It's a great book.
Yeah, I love the stories of Alex the parrot, for example. I think they're so compelling. I was on a Zoom call with Irene Pepperberg once. I was like a little bit starstruck, who's the person who worked with Alex the parrot, who was a parrot who was able to communicate quite sophisticatedly in English. But yeah, you're right. There's this desire that we have, I think, to be like, oh, well, if the whales are going to communicate with us, we need to teach them to speak English. We need to teach the dolphins to speak English. I think that there have been attempts in, the sort of like long and fraught history of, you know, work with cetaceans where, you know, it's been like, let's teach them to understand symbols that we understand, or, you know, let's teach the chimps to use sign language. Yeah, and I think that like, that's not really fair, is it? I mean, you know, certainly, you know, communication goes both ways, right? Any type of a relationship, it has to be reciprocal. I mean, this is what Robin Walkenmeier talks about. So in her masterful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that if everyone on this call has not read it or listened to it, because you can listen to it in her beautiful voice, please go and listen to that book. But you know, she talks about the idea of being in reciprocity with others, and that is really conditional to be in right relationship, not just with another person, but with another species. And so I don't think that we can have it be this like one-way communication, right? We have to also lean towards them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you for that question, Madison. The next question is from Magli. Magli, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you both so much. That was so I was curious to know, Jenny, if there was a turning point for you where your art started focusing on the natural world outside of humans and climate change.
Great question. Yeah, I almost think that it was like, that is what I was always interested in, but I lost the thread for a little while. You know, when I was a little kid, all I wanted to do was like paint little pictures of beetles and bird feathers and make collections of berries and be out in the woods. And, you know, I remember being, you know, having the folders with like endangered species on them and thinking like, how are humans killing snow leopards? Like that is just like unfathomable to me, that we could live in a world where, you know, that we're allowing that to happen. So it's kind of been like a pain of loss that I've felt ever since I was very, very young. Yeah, I think that there was a time where, like, when I was in college, for example, I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art, you know, nature was still in the work, but I was also like it was like a bigger, more expansive thing where I was trying to understand, like, you know, who I was as a young adult. But by the time I was in graduate school, I was like, it was climate, you know, so that was back in 2004, 2006. I was making work that looked very different, but was still really thinking about climate change, which was, you know, a deeply unsexy topic, people thought at the time. And, you know, wanting to make work about the more than human world. And yeah, despite the fact that there was not a lot of interest in that at that time, I was just like, that is what I felt was necessary for me to be talking about. You know, I had this sense of just being like wanting to be in service to the earth. And because I always wanted to be an artist, this felt like the way to do it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Magli, and thank you so much for that answer, Jenny. Before we turn it over to the whale sounds to close us out, I just was wondering, Jenny, with my own question, if you could speak a little bit about the title, Other of Pearl, for the exhibition, which is, you know, so clever, like reflecting sort of slightly separate from Mother of Pearl. But I'm just curious how that title felt, that it related across all of the different inquiries and research projects that culminated in this exhibition.
Yeah, it was another one of those things where it's like, when I thought of it, I just instantly knew that that was the title. You know, the concept of otherness has been so primary in my work for such a long time. And this idea of trying to bridge that gap or trying to, you know, elevate that relationship. So the other of Pearl, you know, this imagination of, you know, some type of, you know, beautiful relationship that we might have. And then there is this theme of the kind of pearl and pearlescence, opalescence all throughout the show that you'll see in every work really presented. There's some type, you know, even the whale eyeball is like a shimmering pearl. the whale instruments have this kind of opalescent quality to them. You know, that's really the magic, honestly, is like sort of thinking about that sense of like of preciousness, right? And really, you know, there is also in the show a reinvestigation of the idea of value. So why is it that we value pearls as gemstones, and we don't value the oyster as an other that we might be in relationship with? And so it's a sort of essential question for us about like, how do we create our systems of value, and might those change? They'll have to change.
It's a beautiful question. Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you all so much for your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to share screen and sound, and we're going to close out today with some whale sounds. Jenny, do you want to introduce these at all before I start playing them?
Sure, yeah. So we talked a little bit earlier about Roger and Katie Payne, who were making these early recordings of humpback whales. This particular one was made in 1978 off the coast of Hawaii. This is the one that I said was given to me to use by David Gruber of Project SETI, who was good friends with Roger. You'll notice in the title of this artwork, I call it the deep cuts. So that's a term, of course, that comes from like the underground dance music world, which I was once part of, and talks about like something that's like a rare groove or a piece of music that is uncommonly heard. And so because this is an unreleased recording from Roger Payne, who otherwise is very famous for whale song, I thought it was a especially exciting thing to both use in this work and to close off this talk with. So please enjoy.
Sorry, I'm going to try playing sounds again. They can sometimes take a moment to play. Are they playing or no? No? Oh, no. Okay. We're going to try one other way. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay. Thank you for handling the technical aspects. It's complicated to do AV through Zoom. We appreciate you.
We're building up the hype. Okay, here we go.
That's great.
So great. Thank you, Jenny, so much. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today for this conversation. And thank you, Julie, for all of your amazing questions today. Thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our new social environment program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support the Rails archive, where you'll be able to watch this shortly on YouTube. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for Publishing in Transit, a conversation with Julie Carr, Tim Roberts, Edwin Torres, and Cole Swenson on the work of Counterpath Press. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks,
Thank you
Jenny.
so much.
Thanks,
Julie.
Jenny.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you, Julie.
Have fun. Hi, Charlie.
Up the whale song.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie.
Hi, nice to see you all.
Thank you, Jenny.
So much.